Hi, and welcome to today's lecture on the letter to the Galatians. My name's Tom Poseen, and in this first session, we're going to look at questions like, who were the Galatians? Who wrote this letter? Why was this letter written? And other details that will help you to properly interpret this book as you're doing your charts. So let's begin with who were the Galatians. Well, to learn that, I think we need to see where they lived. There are a couple of options here. One is kind of the northern Galatian theory. The other one is kind of the southern Galatian theory. And what this means, basically, is that prior to the Roman Empire, there was a kingdom of Galatia. When Rome took over, they expanded it and turned that into the province of Galatia. The difference being the province of Galatia included a lot of the towns in the south that Paul ministered to in his first missionary journeys. So I think, and I will be teaching from the perspective that it is these cities in southern Galatia that this letter is really addressed to. These are cities that Paul planted. These are churches in cities that Paul planted in his first missionary journey. And you'll see early on in this letter, it seems that he is surprised that they have already lost their way. So this is a letter that was written not long after these churches had been established, which is really helpful in understanding where we are in history. Now, to get a better idea of where we are in biblical history, you want to use the book of Acts. Now, from this point forward, as you're doing inductive study, you are going to want to refer to the book of Acts often, because the book of Acts is really kind of the history of the gospel going forward after the resurrection of Jesus. And so Acts 14 and 15 is where we'll find information about Paul's first missionary journey and also something called the Jerusalem Council. Now, why is the Jerusalem Council important? The Jerusalem Council was a gathering of the elders and the apostles in the early church to deal with the exact kind of issues that we find being addressed in the letter to the Galatians. So I think before you get too deep into studying this book, it would be well worth your time to read these 2 chapters of Acts and get a little feel for what's going on here, who these people are, and what the issues really might be. So who wrote this letter? Well, in this case, that's a pretty easy question. There are many books where who wrote it can be a real puzzle. This is not one of those books. Even skeptical scholars tend to agree that Paul wrote this letter. So I think we can just safely take this book at face value. This was a letter from Paul. He says it's from him. And historically, this is almost a sure thing. So we're going to just move on saying Paul wrote this letter. It was probably written not long after his first missionary journey, because he says, I'm surprised that you've had this issue so soon. And so that really does compress our time frame. So what are we talking about? We're probably talking about somewhere between 48 AD and the early 50s. And I would lean more towards 48, 49, because Paul seems amazed that there are false teachers already in there messing up what he has done. So I'm going to go with the earlier dates. And who are these people that are causing the trouble? Well, they are Jews to begin with. And so I think it's not enough just to understand that. There were Jews that opposed Christianity that came in a couple of different flavors in the first century. There were what is sometimes called the unbelieving Jews. You'll hear them referred to as that. These were Jews that basically rejected Jesus as the Messiah, rejected Jesus just full stop. They were the unbelieving Jews. Now, they opposed the gospel for obvious reasons. The second group is the group we're going to hear about in Galatians now, and they are often referred to as the circumcision party, or sometimes just the circumcision, although that word circumcision can mean a lot of things. It can also just be a euphemism for anybody that's Jewish. But when you see this term circumcision party, this is a particular group of Jews, and they had a particular set of beliefs. What were they? Well, unlike the unbelieving Jews, they were not people that rejected Jesus as Messiah. They were people that actually accepted Jesus as Messiah. The problem was they believed that in order to really receive the benefit of what Jesus did as Messiah, you first needed to become a Jew. And what did that mean? Well, if you were a male, that meant circumcision. And it also, as we're going to see as we go through the text of Galatians, it meant as well various food laws and holidays and all kinds of different things that they did to try to honor the law of Moses. And they were essentially adding to the gospel, which was why Paul was so upset. Instead of believing in Jesus and being declared righteousness based on your faith in Jesus, they were saying, yes, you need Jesus, but you also need circumcision and the law. And so what we're going to see in this letter as we move through it is Paul's argument for why this is not the case. And he gets into quite a bit of depth here, and I don't want to get ahead of myself now, so we will just kind of set that aside. But this is really the issue here. False teachers had come in and essentially altered the gospel. And that, for Paul, was the worst imaginable scenario. He now had churches that had embraced Jesus, that had seen the Spirit move, that had come to faith in a kind of a spectacular way, apparently, from the way that it is said in here. And now, in a very short time, have kind of abandoned that and tried to perfect themselves by their own efforts. For Paul, this was the ultimate in futility. This was essentially a rejection of the work of Christ. And so this is why you see so much of this very intense, very emotional, very direct language in here. Paul is extremely worried that all of his work there had been for nothing. And this letter, he was trying to get word to them as quickly as he could, and in these days a letter is probably the fastest way he could contact them, and say, what are you guys doing? Have you forgotten already everything that you've seen, everything that you've heard? So this is really what we're dealing with. So when you see things like the circumcision party or people from James or things like this, what we're really talking about is a group of people that did believe in Christ. However, we're trying to add Jewishness to this. In other words, it was kind of a two-step process for salvation for them. First, you become a Jew, and then you add Jesus. And Paul's like, no, there's Jesus, and that's enough. And so this is really the conflict that we're seeing in this letter. And that forms the background for this entire letter. There's really no other significant theme that is discussed in this letter. It is correcting this fundamental error. So, in our next session, we are going to actually begin to look at the text, and we're going to also review a little bit about the inductive method and how we approach the text. So until next time, I'll see you.